Hey guys. Okay, so not gonna lie, this chapter gave me a bit of emotional whiplash just from how the first page pretty much plunged us right into happy fun times again with Class A. And at first, when reading this chapter, I didn't know how to feel about that, considering it still feels like we're in this sort of awkward phase of Izuku where he isn't exactly in a place to be his usual self. But once I finished reading the chapter, I realized that's kind of the point, to more naturally ease us into what's essentially a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new norm for these characters, and just in general allowing us to take a breather and just appreciate the fact that the gang is back together again, which I know there are still a lot of people who don't like that idea, period, and just prefer like Izuku going down the solo dark path and whatnot. And I do have my own concern I'll get into with it, but I think there is something to appreciate about the fact that Class A is together again at all, because while there is definitely a strong argument to be made that Izuku's solo act could have gone a little bit longer, and we could have seen more of it, the fact of the matter is the human heart and human emotions can only take so much like emotional beating before it gives in and basically screams at us that it basically screams at us in order to stop. And while I have no doubt that given the opportunity, Horikoshi would have probably loved to put Izuku even more through the ringer to the point of turning him into a full-on villain that Class A needed to reform, I think even he realized he needed to think also of progression of the story as well. So no matter what decision was made, I think it would have all ended up at the same place. The only difference being is the longer we'd see Izuku descend into that darkness, the more likely we would have eventually reached our breaking point, and we would have been begging for the reunion regardless. Like I'm saying no matter what, that the reunion was going to happen. Like what we saw at the beginning of this chapter, that was kind of one of those things that was inevitably going to happen regardless. Like I think it's kind of set in stone. Like no matter how much we like Izuku going solo. Now where I do find myself a little bit on the fence is with Jiro's idea that she came up with in this chapter in order to do what she described as something similar to what happened at the cultural festival. And granted, we don't know exactly what it is she's thinking of doing, but I hope it isn't entirely like another concert or something of that nature, because the thing is, while I don't hate this chapter for the route it took, I also feel it's a little bit too soon to be jumping back into something like that, which would be considered a normal school activity for these characters. And don't get me wrong, I love the idea of trying to ease the fears of everyone who's taken shelter at UA. To me, that's even more symbolic of being a hero than going out and confronting a villain. But Horikoshi, just from doing from setting up what he did in this chapter, he needs to be very, very careful with the approach, because the thing is, we're pretty much what I hope, and I think Horikoshi might realize this, but the fact of the matter is we're not really in the whole villain of the week setup he had before. We're kind of dealing with a total villain takeover of society still out there. So I guess what I'm saying is I hope Horikoshi's at least taking consideration of that aspect of the current circumstances into whatever narrative decision he makes here, because if not, it'll feel a little too much like a repeat of the school festival. And I guess what I'm saying and what I'm hoping happens with this setup is we see a lot more like resistance and overall obstacles for Class A to overcome with this, because Horikoshi really needs to play this smart and realize that it isn't entirely the exact same situation as before or as previously. Like we are dealing with we are still dealing with very extenuating circumstances in this whole situation. Now, on top of that, with that said, though, one thing I really loved personally in this is seeing Todoroki's perspective in this, and how and how he feels, almost kind of, I don't know, how he himself feels like he can relate to what Izuku did, because in a lot of ways, as he says, his situation is very similar to Izuku's, in the sense where, in the same breath that Izuku was basically fighting against the idea that people were naturally going to hate him because he had the quirk of one for all, the quirk that all for one seeks, and society naturally hated him for it. He himself also feels like he's walking his own little tightrope himself, that of being both the son of Endeavor and the brother of Dabi, aka Toya. So it's interesting to see just how much like Todoroki himself like feels he can relate to Izuku in this instance, and say I never really thought about what I can, and now he basically says it's a lot of what he's taking in, like a lot of what Izuku took in. He can understand that frustration. He can understand that that feeling of guilt that he needs to take on himself. And I kind of like seeing that, because it shows that Todoroki he was kind of the representative of the other side of that coin, in that he was willing in order to follow the rules a little bit. He wasn't willing to go out on his own, but he was still willing in order to take on the burden, which is very interesting. And yeah, obviously the big thing about this chapter, though, is we learn the knife Stain handed over to All Might actually contains secret intel about Shigaraki and All for One, not only showing that he's been busy the entire time he's been out of prison, but that in some ways you could say he wasn't even killing heroes. He actively made moves to help rebuild society now that there's a chance for change. And yeah, as Hawk points out, it is amazing how the person deemed as one of the greatest threats to hero society turned into one of its greatest heroes or allies, I guess. But obviously, like, Stain is not doing this out of the kindness of his heart either. At the end of the day, I think Stain's really only making this big of a move now because he feels society has finally experienced enough of what he's warned about, that they won't make as much of the same mistakes as before, and that he can kind of at least somewhat entrust society in order to change now. Before now, granted, that doesn't mean he won't still be watching, but for now he's an ally of convenience in this situation, and in some ways the only real hero society has to depend on right now. And with All Might also telling Class A about this, it really starting to feel like we're reaching the climax of the series now, because the end of this chapter for sure definitely felt like the real build up towards it. But yeah, guys, that's pretty much all I got for this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, Analyst, Crunchyroll. Be sure to hit the notification bell, hit the subscribe button, and just share the video around, guys. Dark Knight of Anime, signing off. Later all.